St. Barnabas's Church Hall had never been a place of great excitement. Its wooden floors bore the dull polish of long familiarity. Its pews carried the occasional scuff marks from boots that had long ceased to tread them, and its notice board, festooned with faded announcements of coffee mornings and charity sales, might have been mistaken for a shrine to polite tedium. Yet on that particular Wednesday there was a peculiar vibrancy in the air, as if the town itself had sensed that something, however minor, was about to be awry. The flower show committee had gathered in a semicircle around the trestle tables, displaying meticulously arranged dahlias, chrysanthemums, and a single, rather flamboyant begonia that seemed to demand attention. Mrs. Algernon, resplendent in her usual violet hat, inspected the petals of a particularly proud bloom, and murmured to no one in particular that discipline in cultivation is a virtue increasingly rare in this town. It was the sort of remark that in Flaxborough would have gone unremarked by most. Everyone had their prejudices, everyone had their opinions, and everyone was, in theory, civil enough to ignore them. The practicalities of gossip, after all, thrived more on opportunity than truth. Inspector Purbright, who had been summoned under the pretext of routine oversight, a polite nod from the mayor that nothing serious, but you never know with these committees, observed the proceedings from a corner, hands clasped behind his back. He noted the tight lips of Mr. Hawthorne, the local accountant, as he fussed with the labels on his prize dahlias. He saw the slight twitch of Mrs. Crumble's right eyelid as she debated whether the mild disapproval in the vicar's eyes extended to her flower arrangement. All of it, to Purbright, was a map of subtle human currents, and he allowed himself a small smile. The disturbance began almost imperceptibly. It was not a scream, nor a crash, nor even the fall of a pot. It was the sound of bare feet scraping against polished floorboards. At first the committee thought it might be a child, lost or curious, wandering in from the church steps. But when Miss Eloise Faraday, the organist and sometime dancing instructor, appeared at the edge of the hall, it became evident that the sound was deliberate. She was gliding, almost floating, across the polished boards, entirely barefoot, and entirely unconscious of the audience she had startled. The murmur that rose from the gathered crowd was almost musical in its consternation. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Algernon whispered. Is she rehearsing?" Miss Faraday's eyes sparkled with what might have been delight or madness. It was hard to say from a distance. She turned in a slow circle, then bent to pluck a fallen petal from the floor. A tiny, delicate gesture, yet one that seemed to set off a ripple of discomfort in the air. The vicar, a portly man named Reverend Stedman, approached cautiously. "Miss Faraday," he said, in tones that suggested both curiosity and a polite plea for propriety, "perhaps you might, remove your feet from the chapel flooring?" Miss Faraday blinked, then smiled. "Oh, Reverend," she said lightly, "the floor is merely a stage tonight." "And the stage demands honesty." Mrs. Algernon coughed into her handkerchief. Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat with a suspiciously loud effort, as if to punctuate his disapproval. Even Purbright found himself raising an eyebrow. It might have been dismissed as a harmless eccentricity, if Miss Faraday had not, in the act of one particularly vigorous spin, knocked over a vase containing a prize-winning carnation. The vase teetered perilously, fell, and shattered with a soft clatter that seemed louder than the church's ancient walls might have allowed. There was a pause, a collective inhalation, almost a holding of breath. Purbright, as was his habit, said nothing. He simply moved closer to observe, noting the positions of the shards, the faint smudge of mud on Miss Faraday's otherwise pristine ankles, and the faintly incredulous expression that had crossed the vicar's face. Miss Faraday's smile never faltered. "Accidents," she said, as if revealing a profound truth, "are merely the punctuation of life." The committee, for its part, did not know whether to be scandalized or intrigued. Mrs. Crumble whispered that perhaps a note of discipline was overdue in the chapel, while Mrs. Algernon silently vowed to speak with the mayor about the need for a committee on the regulation of human eccentricities. Purbright, however, understood, as he often did, that beneath the veneer of civility and the polite gaspings of scandal there was a story quietly unfolding. It was small, perhaps trivial, yet persistent enough to unsettle the habitual rhythms of Flaxborough, the broken vase, the bare feet, the delicate defiance in Miss Faraday's eyes. All of it was a puzzle. And as he watched her settle back on her heels and inspect the carnation petals she had inadvertently scattered, Purbright felt the faint thrill of anticipation. A mystery, however minor, had begun. It was the sort of disturbance that would, in the quiet machinery of a small town, ripple outward in unexpected ways. And Purbright, ever patient, would be there to watch it unfold. By Thursday morning, the incident at St. Barnabas's Hall had become, in Flaxborough terms, a matter of considerable significance. The story of Miss Eloise Faraday's barefoot performance and the subsequent carnation catastrophe had migrated from hushed whispers among committee members to the polite, persistent hum of town chatter. At the bakery, Mr. Trevelyan could not resist narrating the events to Mrs. Witherspoon over the warm scent of fresh scones. "You know, it's extraordinary," he said, wiping his flour-dusted hands on his apron. "I never thought the chapel floor would see such theatrical innovation, and barefoot, mind you. Can you imagine?" Mrs. Witherspoon nodded, an expression of grave concern on her face, while internally wondering whether such behavior might signal a decline in public morality, or at the very least a hazard to delicate pottery. At the same time, the post office became a centre of what might politely be called speculative reconstruction. Mrs. Paddock, adjusting her spectacles, leaned over the counter to whisper to Mrs. Redfern, "And then just imagine the vicar himself, poor man, standing there with his mouth open, who knows what he thought." The recipient of this tidbit murmured agreement, though in truth she had little idea what she was agreeing to. Purbright, meanwhile, approached his office with characteristic calm, noting that the very pattern of the gossip offered subtle clues. The stories differed in tone, emphasis, and detail, yet all shared an underlying unease at the unanticipated breach of decorum. Some emphasized the daredevil aspect, Miss Faraday's audacity, while others dwelled on the victimization of the carnation. Each version reflected not just the teller's temperament, but their perception of proper order. The inspector allowed himself a quiet smile at the predictable distortions. It was, he thought, a predictable reflection of human nature. One might call it a social thermometer. The greater the fuss, the smaller the incident, and the more revealing the witnesses. By mid-morning, Purbright found himself summoned for multiple casual encounters. A nod here, a passing comment there, each designed to extract an impression of his concern without the embarrassment of a formal interview. Mrs. Crumble, for example, expressed indignation at the sheer impropriety, insisting that something must be done before the chapel's floors became the stage for further aberrations. Mr. Hawthorne, in contrast, raised the possibility of insurance claims, noting, with the precision of an accountant, that a broken vase constituted tangible loss. Each conversation, in its own way, offered insight. Purbright noted the micro-expressions, the slight hesitation before replies, and the divergence between what people said aloud and what he suspected they felt privately. These quiet inconsistencies were often more illuminating than direct testimony. Even the local newspaper, the Flaxborough Gazette, joined the chorus, albeit obliquely. Its society column praised the flower show for an unexpected flourish of daring, while noting, with what might generously be called mild disapproval, that one performer had eschewed conventional footwear entirely. The choice of words was deliberate, an attempt to maintain civility while hinting at scandal. By late afternoon, Purbright decided to pay a brief visit to Miss Faraday herself. He found her in her modest flat above the bookshop, reclining with a cup of tea and a remarkably serene expression. The faint trace of soil on her ankles suggested that her antics were recent, but her composure was intact. "Inspector," she said, lifting her cup with a tilt of the head, "I trust the town has not been too scandalized?" Purbright inclined his head. "There has been, discussion." He allowed the word to linger, knowing full well the discussion in Flaxborough had a life of its own. "I wondered if you might explain in your own words the reasoning behind the display." Miss Faraday's smile widened, just fractionally. "Reasoning, Inspector? Sometimes a flaw simply demands acknowledgement. Sometimes an audience calls for a gentle disruption. And sometimes," she added, tapping her bare toes lightly on the polished wood, "a carnation falls to remind us that perfection is an illusion." Purbright said nothing, making a mental note of the cadence, the emphasis, the slight playfulness in her voice, the very elements that, though minor in themselves, might reveal a deeper intent or temperament. He left her flat with a quiet certainty. Whatever this story would become in the gossip of Flaxborough, it had begun in earnest. The bare feet were not merely eccentricity, they were the first small ripple in what, he suspected, might become a more intriguing current beneath the surface of polite life. And, as always, he would observe, silently, patiently, and without judgment, until the tale itself revealed its shape. By evening, the town hummed with opinions, corrections, and embellishments. Each household, shop, and cafe contributed to the narrative, often contradicting the others, yet all united in the conviction that something, however minor, had been unsettled. Purbright, as ever, noted each variation, storing them quietly, for in Flaxborough the story told in fragments often contained the truth in its interstices. The following morning, Inspector Purbright made his rounds with the deliberate patience that had long defined his method. Flaxborough, despite its seeming ordinariness, was a town where minor incidents acquired a peculiar momentum, and he had learned to follow them with quiet diligence. His first stop was the vicarage. Reverend Stedman received him with a careful smile, the sort that suggested both civility and mild exasperation. "Inspector, you will forgive my concern," he said, gesturing toward the hall table, "but I cannot imagine a display such as Miss Faraday's going unexamined. The parish must maintain its dignity." Purbright inclined his head. "Of course, Reverend. I wonder if you might recount the events of yesterday, as you observed them." The vicar cleared his throat. "Well, it was most irregular. She appeared barefoot, spinning, quite literally, across the floor. I am accustomed to musical accompaniment. To dance as part of a recital, yes, but in this context, the propriety was lacking. I fear the vase was collateral damage." "Indeed." Purbright's voice carried no judgment, merely observation. He noted the slight tremor in Stedman's hands as he straightened his clerical collar, the mild flush in his cheeks. Such details, he knew, often revealed more than the spoken words. Next, he called upon Mrs. Algernon, who had graciously offered tea in her drawing-room, a space adorned with floral patterns that seemed to echo her temperament. "Inspector," she said, producing a tray of delicate biscuits, "this business is most unsettling. One hopes it is an isolated incident." She paused, as if to allow the unspoken implication to resonate. Flaxborough thrives on routine, on predictability. Miss Faraday's caprice threatens that harmony. Purbright sipped his tea slowly, considering her phrasing. Caprice or creativity, he ventured, with mild curiosity. Mrs. Algernon drew herself up. I prefer the former. Creativity has its place, Inspector, but it must be disciplined. Discipline is, after all, the essence of good society. His visits continued, moving from the cautious murmurs of the flower show committee to Mr. Hawthorne's meticulous account of potential financial liabilities. Each conversation was a small revelation. Mrs. Crumble's insistence on moral standards, the postmistress's insistence on accuracy in retelling events, the baker's half-concealed amusement at human eccentricity. Yet it was the quieter moments that intrigued him most. In the market square, he overheard two women debating whether Miss Faraday's display had been intentional or the result of some private dissatisfaction. I heard she's always been fond of theatrics, one whispered, but never like this. The other nodded gravely, adding, perhaps it is a protest, subtle, but clear to those who know her. Purbright allowed the notion to drift past, filing it for consideration. Flaxborough, like any small town, was layered in subtle communication, the whispers, the gestures, the half-smiles that accompanied statements. It was here, among the ordinary and the polite, that he expected to uncover the extraordinary. By late afternoon, he returned briefly to the chapel hall, ostensibly to inspect the scene of the incident. The broken vase had been replaced, the petals carefully rearranged. And yet the floor retained a faint, almost imperceptible smudge where soil had tracked. A minor detail, overlooked by many, but not by Purbright. He knelt to examine it, noting the direction, the depth, the pattern. Not accidental, he murmured to himself, the corner of his mouth twitching in faint amusement. Small signs, subtle movements, often carried the weight of motive. As evening approached, Purbright sat in his office, reviewing the day's observations. Miss Faraday's intent remained unclear, yet a pattern of disruption, minor, human, and deliberate, was emerging. It was not the act itself that demanded attention, but the responses it elicited, the flutter of gossip, the tension between civility and curiosity, the tiny adjustments in social posture. In Flaxborough, the quiet equilibrium was more telling than any loud confession. And Inspector Purbright, as always, preferred the subtleties, the timing of a smile, the hesitation in a reply, the way a hand trembled when it should be steady. By the time he left his office, the town had begun to speculate not only about the display but about Miss Faraday herself. Was she merely eccentric, or did her actions conceal something deeper, perhaps a quiet commentary on the town's complacency? Purbright did not yet know, but he felt certain that the answer lay within the ordinary routines he had begun to observe. Routines that, once disturbed, would inevitably reveal more than the disruption itself. As he walked past the market stalls, he noted the way the townspeople moved, spoke, and glanced at one another. The whispers followed him subtly, almost as if the air itself carried their curiosity. And somewhere amid the politeness and petty indignations, a single truth waited, quiet and patient, to be unearthed. By Friday morning, Flaxborough's whispers had settled into a rhythm of polite conjecture, each inhabitant embellishing the tale of Miss Faraday's bare feet in accordance with their temperament. In such a town it was often the case that the first suspect emerged not through evidence, but through consensus, an almost democratic assignment of blame. In this instance it was Mr. Hawthorne, the accountant, who became the focal point of attention. His precise, punctilious nature had long inspired a combination of admiration and gentle exasperation. That he might have encouraged, facilitated, or even merely overlooked the incident in the chapel was, in the eyes of his peers, entirely plausible. After all, someone had to be accountable for financial prudence, and someone had to answer for mishaps. Purbright received the report with mild curiosity rather than surprise. The local council, taking its cue from the most vocal members of the flower show committee, approached him with what they considered a neat solution. "Inspector," said Councillor Bellingham, adjusting his pince-nez with a flourish, "surely this is a matter of oversight. Mr. Hawthorne is, as you know, meticulous, but even meticulous men can err in judgment." Purbright inclined his head, saying nothing for a moment. "I shall look into it," he replied quietly. His tone suggested diligence, not accusation. He began with a polite interview of Mr. Hawthorne at the accountant's office. The man was at his desk, papers neatly stacked, pencils perfectly aligned. He blinked behind his spectacles, perhaps expecting censure, perhaps merely preparing for the predictable curiosity of law and civility. "Inspector," he said with careful composure, "I assure you I had no part in any theatrical display." "I understand," Purbright replied, noting the slight hesitation before Hawthorne's final word. "I wonder if you could tell me your whereabouts during the flower show." Hawthorne's fingers tapped a precise rhythm on the polished desk. "I was in attendance, of course, supervising the arrangement of the entries and ensuring compliance with the schedule. I cannot account for Miss Faraday's movements. They were unconventional, to say the least." Purbright allowed a pause, observing not just the words, but the manner in which they were delivered. The hands, the blink pattern, the slight narrowing of the eyes, all were subtle indicators of truth or artifice. Yet he withheld judgment. In Flaxborough, the apparent culprit often concealed only a minor part of the story. Later he visited the chapel once more, ostensibly to inspect the replaced vase and the carefully reset floral arrangements. The subtle smudge remained almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet telling to a man trained in quiet observation. He noted how the petals lay, how the floor gleamed in the afternoon light, and how the congregation had already begun to whisper about Mr. Hawthorne's supposed culpability. By mid-afternoon, the town had collectively assumed a narrative in which Hawthorne's meticulous nature had somehow faltered, allowing chaos to intrude into the flower show. Tea shops, the market square, and even the library circulated stories in which the accountant's very virtue had paradoxically led to the disaster. Purbright, however, maintained his calm reserve. He allowed the narrative to unfold around him, gathering details in quiet patience. The consensus, he reflected, was both revealing and deceptive. What people believed to be truth was often more instructive than the fact itself. And Flaxborough, with its careful civility and endless propensity for gossip, offered more than one avenue toward understanding a minor disturbance such as this. Before leaving the chapel, he noted another detail, a faint trace of red lipstick on the edge of the vase. Small, almost trivial, yet entirely inconsistent with Mr. Hawthorne's character. It was a minor, oddly intimate clue, one that might have been overlooked by any other investigator, but not by Purbright. As he walked back through the quiet streets, the subtle irony of the situation was not lost on him. The town had, in the span of a few days, assigned blame, generated a story, and begun to accept it as reality. Yet one small trace hinted that the truth might lie elsewhere. That trace, he suspected, would prove more telling than the collective certainty of Flaxborough's populace. By evening, he sat in his office, cataloguing the testimonies, noting the contradictions, and allowing the faintest smile. A first suspect had been identified as expected, but Purbright knew better than to be swayed by appearances. The dance, the petals, the gossip, all were parts of a larger, quieter puzzle, and he would unravel it in due course, at a pace dictated by patience, observation, and the small but telling signs that others overlooked. It was on Saturday morning, as Purbright sipped his tea, in the calm of his office, that he noticed the trivial detail which would, in his methodical mind, become quietly significant. A note, half concealed under the Daily Post, carried a faint perfume, a soft, floral scent, and was written in a handwriting that suggested elegance without affectation. He unfolded it with care. The note read, "Dear Inspector, you might find it curious that the vase incident coincided with my presence at the hall. Nothing more. E. Faraday." Purbright set the paper aside, letting the words steep in his thoughts. It was a modest confession, almost playful in tone, yet it suggested presence, timing, and, perhaps, deliberate involvement. There was no accusation, no dramatics, merely the quiet insertion of fact into the public narrative. It was the sort of understated communication that often carried more weight than shouting or complaint. Later that morning, he walked through the market, observing the townspeople as they conducted their errands. He noted, with a quiet sort of amusement, the precise manner in which gossip had twisted the story. The accountant, Mr. Hawthorne, was being discussed as though he were a villain in some minor morality play, while Miss Faraday's actual movements, her presence, her bare feet, her careful handling of petals, had been distorted into a caricature. The trivial but odd detail of the note suggested a discrepancy. The town story did not match the facts, and, as ever, Purbright knew that discrepancies, no matter how slight, were often where the truth quietly waited. He returned to St. Barnabas's Hall, ostensibly to review the floral arrangements and the polished floors once more. The broken vase had been replaced as expected, and the petals were neatly repositioned. Yet a faint smear on the polished boards caught his eye. A slight trace of mud, almost imperceptible, leading from the side entrance toward the center of the hall. The smear was subtle, casual, as though the person responsible had been unconcerned with concealment, yet sufficiently telling to a trained observer. Purbright knelt to examine it, noting the curve and the direction. It was neither haphazard nor accidental. The line traced a deliberate path, suggesting movement with purpose rather than random misstep. This, combined with the note, began to form a pattern. Presence, action, and a subtle hint of theatricality. By afternoon, he quietly interviewed a few of the flower show stewards, seeking small corroborations. Mrs. Crumble mentioned seeing Miss Faraday adjusting entries with particular attention, almost lingering, as though making a statement, while another committee member observed the peculiar arrangement of petals near the newly polished floorboards. Each account was trivial in isolation, but collectively they suggested that someone, perhaps the very person writing the note, had orchestrated aspects of the scene with a careful eye for impression. The town, meanwhile, continued to chatter, blissfully unaware of the more subtle clues emerging beneath the surface. Councillor Bellingham was still certain of Mr. Hawthorne's culpability, and the café discussions remained lively with speculation. Yet Purbright, noting the gap between narrative and detail, understood that appearances were rarely the whole story. As evening descended, he returned to his office, considering the day's findings. Miss Faraday's note, the faint smudge, the careful placement of petals. Each was a small, trivial detail, yet together they hinted at deliberate intention. The first suspect, neatly assigned by town consensus, seemed less certain now. Purbright leaned back in his chair, hands folded, eyes attentive. The town's stories swirled around him, a kaleidoscope of conjecture and exaggeration, while the true pattern lay in the minor traces, the quiet signals, the understated gestures. He allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The investigation, which had seemed straightforward, was quietly, intriguingly expanding. The truth, he knew, would not arrive in the form of spectacle. It would emerge in the subtleties, the barely perceptible, the almost trivial, the carefully observed. And Flaxborough, with its polite chatter and penchant for small dramas, would provide more than enough material to reveal it, if only one had the patience to watch and the wisdom to read the signs correctly. By Sunday, the town of Flaxborough had become, in its usual gentle way, a theatre of observation. Purbright, walking the quiet streets before the morning post arrived, noted the subtle shifts in behaviour. Shopkeepers glanced furtively toward the chapel, townspeople lingered near market stalls, eager to share a half-confirmed story, and even the local children, usually indifferent to adult affairs, whispered with the sort of conspiratorial glee that only a minor scandal could provoke. It was in the post office that he first encountered a hint of complexity beyond the initial incident. Mrs. Paddock, tending her counter, glanced up from stamping envelopes and said, with a tone somewhere between curiosity and exasperation, "Inspector, you may find this of interest. Mr. Ledbury was inquiring whether Miss Faraday's arrangements might have been intentional, in a way not immediately obvious." Purbright raised an eyebrow, making no move to interrupt. Mr. Ledbury, he knew, was a retired schoolmaster with a fondness for moral order and a subtle talent for over-interpretation. That his curiosity now focused on motivation rather than mere mischief was a small but significant development. Later he spoke with Mrs. Crumble, whose tea-room had become an informal hub of discourse. She offered her own observations, not all of which she fully understood herself. "It's not just the bare feet, Inspector," she said, leaning forward with lowered voice. "It's the way she looks at people, almost expectantly, as if she wants to see who notices, who judges." Purbright made a mental note of the emphasis, filing it carefully alongside the trail of details he had already collected. The note, the smudge, the subtle arrangement of petals, the misaligned narrative of the townspeople. Each fragment was small, almost trivial, yet collectively they hinted at a pattern of deliberate orchestration. By mid-morning, he had also observed the subtle frictions among the flower show committee. Mrs. Algernon, still affronted by the incident, confided to a trusted acquaintance that the order of things had been violated, though she could not articulate precisely why it mattered. Mr. Hawthorne, for his part, maintained a cautious neutrality, his precise gaze observing reactions rather than acting impulsively. The tension between civility and curiosity, which so often animated Flaxborough, was now palpable. Purbright's next encounter was with the vicar, who seemed reluctant to speak of Miss Faraday, but could not entirely resist. "Inspector, she has always had flair," Reverend Stedman admitted, "though never so disruptive. One wonders if there is a message behind the movements, something we are too polite to articulate." By the afternoon, Purbright had also taken note of Mr. Ledbury's daughter, Miss Cecilia Ledbury, who had attended the hall as a volunteer steward. She spoke in a measured, careful tone, emphasizing the charm and whimsy of Miss Faraday's behavior while hinting at small, overlooked signs. A glance exchanged with a committee member, a deliberate pause near the vase, a slight touch of petals with exaggerated care. Each new account added texture, complexity, and subtle contradiction. The investigation, initially confined to a single peculiar display, was expanding. Every person he spoke with contributed not merely information, but a reflection of their own perceptions, prejudices, and desires. Flaxborough, he observed, was revealing itself through the incident, rather than the incident revealing itself directly. By evening, Purbright returned to his office, the town's gossip settling into a quiet murmur outside his window. He reviewed the day's observations, multiple perspectives, each highlighting different facets of the same event, subtle gestures, minute actions, and the quietly deliberate traces of intention. What had begun as a minor disruption, a barefoot performance and a broken vase, was evolving into a social study of manners, motives, and small-town politics. Purbright leaned back, hands folded. The town had, in its usual fashion, provided both theatre and distraction. Yet beneath the chatter, beneath the polite conjecture and half-understood indignation, lay a series of small, telling signs, and it was in those signs, in the smudges, the glances, the subtle performances of civility, that the truth quietly waited. He allowed himself a faint smile. Flaxborough, in all its ordinary charm, had offered him more than enough threads to follow, and he would follow them, one careful step at a time, until the quiet pattern behind the disruption revealed itself. Monday arrived with a pale, uncertain sun, casting long shadows across Flaxborough's streets. Purbright, accustomed to observing the town's rhythms, noted the subtle tension in the market square. Conversations were quieter, glances more pointed, and the lingering whispers of the flower show incident had not yet faded. It was then that a second incident occurred, one far less theatrical, but considerably more puzzling. At the local library, a minor, almost trivial theft had taken place. A book, rare but modestly valued, had disappeared from the reference shelf, a compendium of English floral arrangements. The theft was reported by the librarian, Miss Penelope Wren, who appeared both flustered and mortified. "I don't understand," she said, wringing her hands as Purbright arrived. "It was here yesterday. No one leaves it out unless supervised, and now it's gone. Simply gone." Purbright examined the shelf and the surrounding area. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that indicated haste or carelessness. Yet the book's absence, coinciding as it did with the growing murmur surrounding the flower show, suggested deliberate timing. He spoke with Miss Wren at length, listening not merely to the words, but to the pauses, the gestures, and the subtle inflections. "It is odd," she admitted, "that anyone would be interested in this particular volume, yet perhaps someone thought it relevant to the events at St. Barnabas." Purbright made a mental note. Timing and relevance in his experience were more revealing than the act itself. The first suspect, Mr. Hawthorne, now seemed less likely to be involved, at least in this minor but oddly connected incident. Word of the library theft rippled through Flaxborough with the characteristic speed of small-town gossip. At the cafe, Mrs. Crumble expressed the view that the theft must be linked to Miss Faraday's earlier display. "It is not merely coincidence," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "The woman has ideas that are unorthodox. Perhaps the book held some inspiration for her, or worse, some plan we cannot yet comprehend." Purbright, quietly listening from a corner table, noted the pattern. The town's tendency to connect dots, whether logically related or not, and the subtle way assumptions hardened into belief. Later in the day, he returned to St. Barnabas's hall. Miss Faraday was there, tidying a small arrangement of vases in preparation for the upcoming week's recital. She appeared calm, almost serene, entirely unconcerned by the renewed attention. "Inspector," she said, glancing up with a faint smile, "I hear the town is busy drawing connections." Purbright inclined his head, noting the absence of defensiveness. "Yes, indeed. Curious how quickly coincidences become narratives." She tapped a finger lightly on the edge of a vase. "Narratives are comforting, Inspector. They allow people to see patterns where none may exist. Yet patterns, if one looks carefully, can reveal intent." The remark, delivered casually, struck Purbright with its understated precision. It was, in effect, both a statement and a challenge, suggesting awareness of scrutiny while providing nothing overt. By evening, the librarian had recovered from her initial distress, but the town's sense of unease remained. The second incident had subtly shifted attention, reminding all that the initial disruption beneath the barefoot performance and broken vase was not an isolated spectacle, but part of a sequence, however minor. Purbright reflected on the day's events as he prepared his notes. The first suspect, neatly identified by public consensus, was no longer a convenient answer. The addition of a second, temporally connected incident, trivial yet deliberate, complicated the narrative and opened new avenues of inquiry. In Flaxborough, the ordinary and the extraordinary existed in a delicate balance. Each small act, each whisper, each glance contributed to the town's shared story. And Purbright, ever patient, would continue to observe, to note, and to consider, quietly assembling the pieces until the complete picture, subtle and civil, could at last be revealed. Tuesday morning found Purbright in the quiet of his office, a cup of tea cooling gently beside a stack of carefully annotated notes. The town, as ever, continued its polite speculation, but he preferred the solitude that allowed uninterrupted reflection. Small towns had a rhythm, and disturbances, keen no matter how minor, followed their own patterns, discernible only to those who watched attentively. He considered the events of the past week, the barefoot performance, the broken vase, the curious note, the smudge on the chapel floor, and the theft of the floral compendium. Each incident, trivial on its own, now formed a subtle lattice of human behavior, motivations, and half-hidden intentions. What struck him most was the manner in which the townspeople had assigned blame so readily, their assumptions layered over one another like a carefully stacked arrangement of petals. Purbright allowed himself a small smile at the predictable irony. Flaxborough's civility, so cherished, often masked the very impulses it pretended to restrain. People observed, judged, and misjudged, and in doing so revealed as much about themselves as about the objects of their attention. He turned his thoughts to Miss Faraday. The note she had sent was playful but deliberate, a mild intrusion into the town's narrative, suggesting presence and awareness without confession. Her casual remarks at the chapel had hinted at intentionality, and yet there remained no overt evidence of wrongdoing. The true challenge, as he perceived it, was to distinguish between performance and premeditation, whim and intention. Purbright reflected on human nature, on the subtle motives that often lay beneath politeness, the desire for recognition, the pleasure of mischief concealed, the gentle assertion of individuality against communal expectation. Each citizen, he had observed, carried these impulses in varying degrees, and each incident could now be read as a manifestation of such quietly expressed desires. He reviewed the pattern of observation systematically. The bare feet had been deliberate, the smudge suggested movement with intent, the note indicated awareness. The floral compendium's disappearance introduced a second layer, not of chaos, but of subtle planning. Even the townspeople's responses were telling. The manner in which gossip spread, the way conjecture hardened into perceived truth. All of this, he realized, pointed toward a carefully orchestrated sequence, one in which appearances were manipulated and assumptions quietly challenged. Yet to confront the responsible party required finesse. In Flaxborough, a direct accusation would have invited defensiveness, embarrassment, or polite outrage. Purbright allowed his mind to drift toward the solution, considering the question he might pose, the scenario he might stage, to reveal both truth and character. The test would need to be civil, understated, and almost imperceptible, a single, well-placed remark or question that would elicit an involuntary reaction. It was, he thought, the artistry of his craft, to invite revelation without force, to observe the unguarded truth in the gentle fissures of composure. By mid-morning, he had devised a plan. A small gathering at the chapel, ostensibly to review arrangements for the week's recital, would provide opportunity. The subtle cues he would deploy, a comment about attention to detail, a fleeting reference to the floral compendium, a polite acknowledgement of bare feet, would serve as his test. The guilty party, if aware and deliberate, could not resist the delicate trap of self-confirmation. Purbright leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, eyes steady. The town's gossip, the minor theft, the eccentric display, all were threads to be carefully pulled. The challenge was to maintain civility, preserve appearances, and allow the pattern to reveal itself naturally. As the morning light filtered through the window, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan taking shape. The answer, he knew, would arrive not in spectacle or confrontation, but in observation and subtlety, in the faint blush, the unguarded glance, the slightest inflection that betrayed deliberate intention. And in Flaxborough, he reflected, there was ample opportunity for such revelation, if only one had the patience, the attention, and the wisdom to notice. By Wednesday afternoon, St. Barnabas's Hall had regained much of its ordinary appearance, though the subtle tension remained, imperceptible to all but the most observant. Purbright arrived quietly, noting the floral arrangements, the polished floors, and the gentle hum of the townspeople preparing for the week's recital. The setting was perfect, civil, routine, and entirely unsuspecting of the small theatre of observation about to unfold. Miss Faraday was present, arranging a few vases with the same deliberate care she had displayed before. She glanced up briefly, offering a faint, polite smile. Purbright returned the gesture with equal civility, taking his place near the side entrance, allowing the room to settle into its usual rhythm. The stewards and committee members milled about, discussing schedules, entries, and trivial details. Into this ordinary bustle, Purbright introduced his subtle test, phrasing it as an innocuous question. "Miss Faraday," he said, inclining his head, "I noticed the floral compendium is missing from the library. Quite curious, given your evident interest in arrangements. Perhaps you might share if you were aware of its movements." The room remained polite and quiet, though a slight tension subtly gathered around her. Miss Faraday's hands paused over a vase. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the nearest steward. A micro-expression, almost imperceptible, hinted at recognition. "Oh, Inspector," she said smoothly, though her tone carried a delicate trace of amusement. "I cannot claim to have discovered the book's absence, though I am aware that floral study sometimes inspires curiosity." Purbright observed her posture, the careful placement of her fingers, the fraction of a second hesitation before her next word. The reaction was telling, though elegantly contained. He allowed a pause, giving the moment space to develop. Then he continued, with the faintest note of dry wit, "I trust that any enthusiasm for floral arrangement does not extend to temporary acquisition, however minor." Miss Faraday's smile remained, but her eyes betrayed a subtle acknowledgment. The faint blush on her cheeks, the slight tightening of the fingers now resting atop the vase, were signals that he had anticipated. She was caught not in accusation, but in recognition. The gentle revelation of deliberate participation. Purbright nodded slightly, saying nothing further. The conversation moved on as if nothing had occurred, leaving the observer with the certainty that the pattern had been quietly discerned. He made no public pronouncement, allowed no dramatics, and preserved the civility that Flaxborough so cherished. Later he spoke privately to the vicar and a few trusted committee members. In careful, understated terms he explained the sequence, The deliberate barefoot display, the smudge on the floor, the minor theft of the compendium, and the timing of each action. He spoke without emphasis, letting the natural logic of events and the subtle reactions observed during the staged gathering provide their own confirmation. "The matter," he said finally, "is resolved. Nothing more is needed than the recognition of intent and a polite awareness of human behavior. The town may return to its routines, reassured that the sequence, though curious, was not malicious." As he left the hall, the air of ordinary civility resumed. The whispers and glances persisted, but now with a quieter undertone, a faint acknowledgment that the incident had been understood, without spectacle, without reprimand, and without the dramatics that so often accompanied small-town scandals. Purbright returned to his office, content to allow the day to close in normalcy. The threads of observation, minor as they seemed, had converged neatly. The deliberate orchestration, the playful challenge, the minor theft, all were accounted for, understood, and reconciled with the town's gentle rhythms. He settled into his chair, noting the small details of handwriting, petal placement, and micro-expression that had revealed the truth. The town, in its polite chatter, might never fully appreciate the precision of the investigation, but that was, he reflected, of no consequence. The pattern had emerged quietly, civilly, and entirely Flaxborough in character. Thursday morning brought a pale drizzle to Flaxborough, softening the edges of the market square and washing the town's modest facades in a reflective sheen. Purbright arrived at St. Barnabas's Hall with measured pace, observing the quiet diligence of stewards setting up the week's recital. It was the perfect moment to draw the investigation to its understated conclusion. He had arranged a small gathering of committee members, the vicar, and a few others whose perspectives would clarify the sequence without inviting spectacle. The town by now had grown accustomed to minor eccentricities, and no one appeared perturbed by his presence. The hall carried the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers, a benign stage for the civil explanation that was to follow. "Ladies and gentlemen," Purbright began with the same polite tone that had guided his entire enquiry, "I should like to recount what has transpired, quietly and civilly, and in a manner that allows the facts themselves to speak." He first addressed the barefoot display. "Miss Faraday, as you know, executed a deliberate sequence of movements yesterday. Her intent was not disorderly, nor was it negligent. The steps she took, the placement of petals, and the resulting smudge upon the floorboards were all part of an orchestrated, if unconventional, demonstration of attention to detail and aesthetic sensibility." A gentle murmur of comprehension circulated, though no one spoke aloud. Purbright's calm delivery left space for thought rather than emotion. He then connected the minor theft. The floral compendium, which went temporarily missing from the library, was part of this same sequence. Its removal was neither malicious nor harmful, but rather an element of preparation, a necessary step in the creation of a controlled environment for observation. The book's absence, though noticed by the diligent Miss Wren, was limited in duration and significance. The committee members exchanged polite glances, and Miss Faraday's posture remained composed, though a faint, knowing smile touched her lips. Purbright allowed a slight pause before continuing. "The first suspect, Mr. Hawthorne," he said gently, "was, as town gossip suggested, entirely uninvolved in either the display or the minor theft. His meticulous attention to civic order ensured that disruption remained minimal. The initial assumptions were, in essence, an understandable misdirection, arising from the natural human tendency to attribute cause to the most visible figure." He then highlighted the subtle clues, emphasizing the seemingly trivial but telling details: the note left by Miss Faraday, the faint smudge on floor, the deliberate timing of each action, and the small theatricality that had drawn the town's attention. Each of these, individually minor, collectively formed a pattern, and it is this pattern, and the manner in which it was observed, that reveals intent. No one objected. No one needed to. In Flaxborough, civility and comprehension often replaced overt reaction. The explanation required neither drama nor accusation. The truth, once calmly presented, spoke for itself. Purbright concluded with a final, understated remark. What might have seemed chaos was in fact careful orchestration. The town may resume its routines with the reassurance that nothing harmful occurred, that civility remained intact, and that attention to detail, even when expressed unconventionally, has been duly noted and understood. The room remained quiet, the impact of his words sinking in without fuss or spectacle. Miss Faraday's faint smile, the nods of the committee members, the quiet relief of the vicar, each reaction confirmed the resolution of the minor scandal without overt drama. Purbright returned to his office later, reviewing the notes, observing the slight adjustments in petal arrangements, the alignment of books, and the subtle traces of civility restored. Flaxborough, as always, had absorbed the unusual events with calm efficiency, gossip softened into anecdote, and minor disorder transmuted into quiet memory. He settled into his chair, reflecting on the human tendencies revealed by the incidents, the readiness to assign blame, the enjoyment of narrative, the subtle satisfaction of recognizing orchestration, and the patience required to discern the truth beneath civility and propriety. The town, for all its small dramas and whispered conjectures, had been restored to its ordinary, charming equilibrium, as much as Flaxborough ever was anyway. Friday morning arrived with a soft silver light filtering through the narrow streets of Flaxborough. The market square, usually animated with quiet commerce and polite chatter, carried an air of resumed normality. Purbright walked the familiar route to St. Barnabas's Hall, noting that the town had subtly adjusted to the revelations of the past week. Gossip had shifted to matters less delicate, and the small tension that had accompanied Miss Faraday's display had diffused into ordinary curiosity. The hall itself was quiet, almost serene. The polished floors gleamed under the morning light, petals were carefully arranged, and the floral compendium rested on its shelf in the library, returned without ceremony. Miss Faraday was present, arranging vases with her characteristic precision. She looked up as Purbright entered, offering a polite nod, the faint trace of a smile lingering at the corners of her lips. Purbright surveyed the scene. Each detail, the petals, the vases, the subtle alignment of objects, confirmed what he had already deduced. The incidents were intentional but harmless, a demonstration of careful orchestration rather than mischief. The town had observed, conjectured, and assigned blame, but the pattern was now clear, and civility had remained unbroken throughout. He addressed a small gathering of committee members and the vicar, recapitulating the sequence one final time. His tone was calm, understated, leaving no room for exaggeration, no space for melodrama. Miss Faraday's actions, he said, were deliberate, executed with attention to detail, and entirely without malice. The barefoot performance, the subtle smudge upon the floor, and the temporary removal of the floral compendium were all parts of a planned, controlled sequence. The town's first suspicions naturally fell upon Mr. Hawthorne, but his meticulous attention ensured that no genuine disruption occurred. The pattern, as observed, reveals intention, not error. The committee members listened in quiet comprehension. Miss Faraday's serene composure, combined with the precise clarity of Purbright's words, rendered further commentary unnecessary. The narrative had been explained, but the civility of Flaxborough remained intact. A delicate balance between order and human curiosity. Purbright noted the subtle reactions. The vicar's relieved nod, Mrs. Crumble's faint smile, Mr. Ledbury's reflective glance. Even minor adjustments, such as the slight straightening of a vase or the gentle smoothing of petals, became gestures of reconciliation with understanding. The town had absorbed the explanation, restoring equilibrium without spectacle and without undermining the dignity of any participant. As the small gathering dispersed, Purbright lingered briefly, observing the quiet rhythms of the hall. He reflected on human nature, the ease with which assumptions harden, and the patience required to uncover truth beneath civility and rumour. Small towns, he mused, were as revealing as they were ordinary. Every glance, every whisper, every gesture carried meaning, if one only took the time to watch. Returning to his office, he settled at his desk, pen in hand, recording the final observations. The incidents of the past week, the barefoot display, the minor theft, the subtle orchestration, had all been resolved. The town would carry forward, its routines undisturbed, its minor scandal quietly catalogued as a story for polite conversation. Purbright allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. In Flaxborough, the extraordinary had passed quietly through the ordinary, leaving civility intact, curiosity satisfied, and the human tendency to observe, judge, and understand gently affirmed. The town resumed its gentle rhythms, and the inspector returned to paperwork, content with the subtle, civil triumph of observation and patience. The light outside shifted to a gentle afternoon glow. Flaxborough, in its enduring charm, remained a town of minor dramas, whispered observations, and careful civility, perfectly ordinary, and yet never quite so simple as it seemed.